And so what happened with both these debates really underscored this continued shift that we're seeing in the country's media landscape. Obviously, most notably highlighted by the inclusion of Rebel News, which is essentially like Canada's answer to Alex Jones's InfoWars. And so this move is not just controversial, it's very emblematic of this deeper, disturbing trend. Again, Rebel News under Ezra Levant, a figure whose primary contribution to journalism is transforming this age-induced grift model into a business empire. And, he's received significant legitimacy from his mainstream media exposure. Predictably, the decision to even just allow them in general sparked a lot of outrage, amplified by concerns over the exclusions of many legitimate political voices, obviously like the Green Party. And so I really had to sit with this and think about it for a little bit, because it didn't fully occur to me until I saw Jesse Brown of Canadaland, Canada's self-styled guardian of journalistic ethics from a quote-unquote leftist perspective, because he took to his platform to address what happened in his April 18th episode titled Ezra Levant's Debate Night Circus. And of course, Brown condemned the debate commission's decision not simply just for elevating Rebel News, for ostensibly muddying journalistic standards, is what he said. And then with that, along with a very long tweet thread diatribe, Jesse Brown has argued basically for a return to what he called first principles of journalism, objective reporting divorced from explicit advocacy. And for Jesse Brown, the inclusion of outlets like Rebel News threatens the public discourse by legitimizing misinformation and extremism. And obviously, to a lot of people, at first glance, what Jesse Brown seems to be saying is accurate. It's very much like what I was just saying a second ago about Rebel News and CBC's inability to take a stance and allowing space for this encroaching extremism within media. And so obviously, for anyone on the left, who wouldn't oppose giving airtime to blatant right-wing extremism and right-wing media disinformation? But if you just take 1 second to think about what he's saying here and scratch beneath this veneer of parent principled left of center social democrat media figure, you quickly see something far more insidious that's lurked right beneath the surface here. Jesse Brown's insistent on a rigid divide between journalism and activism is not a neutral stance. It serves a specific ideological function, and that's weaponizing journalistic ethics to silence actual, genuine activist journalists by subtly equating anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, real activist journalists, equating those types of people with confrontational, reactionary, type of old Sun Media and now Rebel News folks, agitators, etc. Equating the two. Eve Angler is a great example of this. He's very much known for unapologetic confrontations and disruptions with various Canadian political figures, including people within the Liberal Party of Canada. And I first really became aware of what Jesse was doing here in September of 2022. There was some type of far-right convoy activist who confronted Chrystia Freeland in Alberta, not in any type of violent way, but loudly and bombastically. And in an episode of Canadaland, Jesse Brown quickly labeled this confrontation as harassment and effectively managed to subtly lump in people like Eve Angler and other fellow activists into the same category as these far-right agitators, far-right provocateurs, who generally seem to represent a threat to public safety. But I would also contend that many of those people are known to the police, known to the security apparatus, and are essentially allowed to do what they're going to do because it serves the Liberals' purpose because of both of these things. It's a multi-pronged type situation because you externalize the far right by making the status quo ruling party seem more palatable because they're more quote-unquote normal and less extreme, while also equating these very reactionary, far-right, crypto-fascist media figures who pose as activist journalists with real activist journalists who have principled stances against colonialism and Canada's complicity and atrocity and in their geopolitics and things like that. And this framing isn't isolated, right? It is indicative of a deliberate rhetorical strategy to delegitimize activist journalism under this guise of ethical neutrality. And this really, again, this radical centrism. And herein lies the crux of the problem with Jesse Brown and his approach to all of this. By setting up journalism and activism as irreconcilable opposites, he creates this false equivalence that not only distorts reality, but actively enables essentially what is the criminalization of legitimate dissent through journalism. Because activist journalists, people whose work directly challenges the power structures rather than parroting established talking points like Canadaland does, those authentic activist journalists become collateral damage in this rhetorical maneuver that Jesse and Canadaland and many other media figures partake in. And this vision effectively places progressive and anti-colonial journalists who support liberation causes on the same footing as people like Ezra Levant, in the same type of reactionary circus, which again really only serves to embolden the far right and these radical liberals, and in doing that, legitimizing state crackdowns against authentic leftist voices. And again, there's more than just Jesse Brown that does this, but this positioning aligns, in a very disturbingly perfect way with broader historical and political dynamics that have always been at play in modern Canada. The media landscape, especially partisan mainstream media figures, they operate in a framework of like literal political kayfabe, like professional wrestling. And it's all like driven by this manufactured outrage and performative confrontation. And what you see essentially is that far-right agitators mimic the same left-wing confrontational tactics. And then centrists feign shock, and establishment voices like Jesse Brown and others call predictably for increased policing and surveillance and crackdowns on these types of journalists. It is a very choreographed spectacle that is reminiscent of the Cold War era strategy of tension type operations. It's a soft version of that, where governments encourage political instability to justify clamping down on legitimate dissent. And Canadaland, despite its quote unquote progressive reputation, that media outlet, especially with Jesse Brown, if you look at his history, it very much often functions as controlled opposition rather than any type of genuine place to find a true critique. Because what it does is it channels progressive outrage into safer avenues: identity politics, nationalism, and then eventually liberal Zionism. It effectively defangs systemic critiques of the Canadian state and channels that outrage towards more acceptable narratives, and narratives that can be used in the common political discourse, right? It is used as a conduit for more radical critiques and then brings them to a place that is more acceptable, rather than having like a genuine challenge to the establishment. Oftentimes you see media figures and media groups like Canadaland reinforce the authority of the state and divert attention from any type of real structural critique, and instead move it towards more superficial moral posturings. This is not merely theoretical either. Like Jesse Brown's rhetoric has very tangible, dangerous consequences, because this kind of superficial objectivity provides intellectual cover for these types of centrists to equate far-right extremism with activist journalists. And the result is a greater vulnerability for genuine activist journalists and increased state powers and policing powers of people who do legitimate political activism and legitimate activist journalism. And while they might not be explicitly advocating for censorship, this framing enables exactly what I'm talking about. And so this position that Jesse Brown is taking represents more than just like a misguided insistence on journalistic purity. It actively aligns, unintentionally or not, with the security state and the surveillance apparatus in Canada, with this rigid opposition to activist journalism and a false equivalence between leftist activist journalism and political confrontations with political figures and far-right agitators and provocateurs. It facilitates a state narrative that criminalizes dissent and the right for free expression through journalism. And it works because Canadaland, because of its reputation as a quote-unquote left-of-center liberal media organization, right? He's able to position himself as journalism's ethical arbitrator. And in practice, he's aiding the very structures that he's claiming to protect the public against. And so this alignment and the way that it is expressed through this kayfabe of political spectacle, it very much benefits two groups. It benefits the far right because they gain legitimacy through these false equivalences. And then the Canadian state, which uses these equivalences to justify suppressing genuine activism. Jesse Brown, whether he knows it or not, is playing right into the larger strategy that undermines democratic discourse, freedom of the press, and meaningful political dissent. And their inclusion in these types of political media events, it might initially appear like a principled stance, but the deeper ideology at play here is positioning itself against something. And in doing that, it is profoundly damaging because by lumping authentic activist journalists together with far-right extremists who continue to be more and more extreme and using that equivalence under the same condemnation umbrella, you're enabling dangerous precedents that ultimately protect power. And it also fails the question of how someone can have an objective understanding if something is harmful or not, if some type of journalism or some type of media is harmful or not, or if it's coming out of a place of good faith. And that's the thing, is that the real danger in this is not the far-right media in itself. It's the systemic erosion of legitimate dissent and how it is being facilitated by voices like people like Jesse Brown, because the more and more that you have people that are masquerading as activist journalists who are less and less principled and more reactionary, what it does is that it serves as an equivalence to people who are principled, use their journalism as a mode of activism. And so by using that rhetoric of neutrality to try to reinforce an overall conformity and silence of anyone who has a true principled radical critique, you're just serving the state's motives, whether you know it or not. That's what you're doing. And that's what Canadaland, that's what Jesse Brown, that's what many other people in this like the radical liberal media sphere are doing. That's what their function is, whether they know it or not, that is what is happening. So if you're going to critique, CBC and just the general liberal media apparatus for allowing these types of far-right bad faith actors into the discourse, just make sure to understand what that discourse does and who it serves. And so I only realize this part that I'm explaining now after how I saw other people were reacting to what was being said in the media. So just be on the lookout for that is basically my point.